Let's talk about title.
They have fulfilled, they're going to need to fulfill.
Let's talk about title. What's involved with title in a real estate transaction?
So title is very key to a real estate transaction because that is what allows us to confirm to the buyer they're going to get clean ownership of the house. So what happens is once you enter into contract, the buyer's attorney will order a title report. It usually takes a few weeks to come in, 2 or 3 weeks, depends on the company and depends on how quick the municipality turns around the searches that are requested by the title company. But in essence, a title report can be anywhere from 20, 30, 40 pages, and it is a snapshot in essence of the sellers, the buyer, and the property that is being sold to confirm the status. Title reports will show things such as judgments, liens, mortgages, if there's any violations against the property, the certificates of occupancy for the home, if the taxes have been paid. And what happens is there'll be what's called a Schedule B, list of exceptions. These are certain items that the seller's attorney and potentially the buyer's attorney needs to clear in order for the title company to insure the buyer at closing and provide the buyer with what's called a fee policy or a title insurance policy. Now, the title insurance policy protects the buyer in a few different ways. The first way is it ensures you take the property free and clear of judgments, liens, and mortgages other than your own mortgage if you're getting one. But if it's your mortgage, that's okay. The second aspect of it ensures that the boundary lines of your property are properly insured, but only if you order a survey. Well, a common misconception is using an older survey or no survey at all, you'll be afforded the same protection as if you do a brand new one, which you will not. So what happens is without a new survey, the title company will not insure the boundary lines of your property.
Okay.
And if there's ever a dispute over ownership of land, you can't then rely on that policy to defend you in a lawsuit if it escalates to that. Doesn't happen often, but it is a real possibility.
Right.
So, that's a huge key component to the entitled insurance is to ensure you have that survey done to get that protection, because in the event there is a lawsuit or discrepancy over whose land is whose, you then have that protection from the title company.
You mentioned when they run the title report, they're not only looking at the property, but they're looking at the buyer and seller. Why do they inquire about the buyer and seller?
Sometimes the buyers and sellers will have judgments against them, and more so the seller than the buyer. The judgment, if it's against the seller, can and most likely will attach to the property that the seller is trying to sell. So although the judgment in of itself, let's say it's a medical debt, the medical debt has no bearing on ownership of the home in the sense of the ownership is not what caused the debt. The debt was caused by the actions or inactions of the seller not paying that debt. But what the creditor will do is put that lien by operation of law against the house, and that'll disrupt the transaction. Similar with the buyer, less of a concern because some title companies will let a buyer close with a judgment in place, and they'll put what's called an exception in their insurance policy, meaning the title company's not covering, guaranteeing, insuring anything relating to that exception. And what happens is the minute the buyer closes, that judgment then will attach to the house. So if the buyer in a year turns around and tries to sell the house, they'll have no recourse against the title company, and now they'll have no choice but to satisfy that judgment in order to sell. So it's a little less stringent, for lack of a better term, on the buyer, but it's definitely something to be mindful of and be concerned of.
So does the title has to be run on every single property that gets transferred in the state of New York? Correct?
So in essence, it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
It would be very foolish not to. I don't believe there's a lender out there that would allow it to go through without a title being ran. But let's say in an all-cash transaction, there's no lender to require it. So in theory, you could close without running a title report. The risk you'd be undertaking would be significant. And I would never recommend it. Quite frankly, I probably wouldn't even represent the client if they didn't want to do the title report in a cash transaction, because the potential liability is astronomical. I actually had one where I was the buyer, and what happened was 2 sellers prior to the person we were buying the house from sold the house to his friend just outright. No banks, no title, no issues. No one was involved in essence. By the time my client came to purchase and we ran title, there was a magnitude of issues. The seller had to clear up about $100,000 in judgments from the seller prior to him, because this seller never ran title when he purchased it, so he basically inherited all of those issues.
Okay, so title's
paramount.
Super important.
Title's paramount. Now, yes, obviously there's a fee associated with it. It is a one-time fee. Most clients understand the significance and the importance of it, but I've had a few clients who've questioned it. Quite frankly, I personally would never buy a house without running title and getting title insurance.
Right.
And that is my recommendation to all clients.
Well, from your personal experience.
I've seen some ugly.
Yeah.
I've seen some ugly.
Yeah. All right. So once you have title and everything is good, what's the next step?
Well, depending on if there's a bank involved or not, in theory, the next step would be a closing if the bank issues what's called a clear to close. So the order of operation with the bank is they'll typically issue a pre-approval or the equivalent prior to enter into the transaction. During the transaction, as you submit further information to the bank and they actually underwrite the file, they'll issue a commitment. And a commitment very simply just says, we will give you a loan on the following terms. The terms are always different per person, right? Depends on credit, cash deposits, so on and so forth. The real takeaway and the real struggle I think I have with clients is understanding the difference between the commitment and their inevitable clear to close. So I have a lot of clients who will get their commitment and go, great, let's set up a closing date.
Yeah.
However, they haven't fulfilled everything they need to fulfill. So the magic words in these transactions is clear to close.
Right.
Until you hear that clear to close from your bank, you are not closing, we are not setting up a closing date. And, you can get there, you just got to do the heavy lifting with the bank.
Okay. And so is the bank reliant upon a portion or so of the title in order to issue their clear to close?
Yes. Yeah, so the bank definitely needs the majority of what's in the title report. Some banks don't require the municipals, such as the CO searches, the violation searches. Those banks, well, most banks, but the ones that don't require the municipals, they really just want to make sure that what they get at closing, which is called a loan policy, it's the equivalent of the fee policy that the buyer gets, but for the bank, is clear, and there's no exceptions. The bank wants to confirm their what's called first position, meaning their mortgage, their security interest is superior to everyone else's, and once they get that, as well as any underwriting conditions that they may have, they'll issue that clear to close. So they have very much a vested interest in that title report.
The contract.
So, one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
In my opinion,